Alright, so now we're wondering, is the plague still around today? And if so, where is it? The answer is yes, it is. And when we look at the United States, it seems to be more concentrated in the western and southwestern U.S. Namely, northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, northern Arizona, far western Nevada, California, and southern Oregon. Alright, so how do we contract infection? Now, Yersinia pestis is transmitted through the bite of a flea. Not that one. This one. Yeah. However, the catch is that in order for the flea to transmit the infection to humans, that flea must also feed on rats. Now, as it happens, the human flea, Pulex irritans, can feed on both rats and humans, although it typically doesn't feed on rats, so it's not too much of a threat to us when it comes to infection with Yersinia pestis. However, Xenopacilla chaopus, or the Asiatic rat flea, is the more common vector that transmits Yersinia pestis infection to humans. Now, much like we talked about last week with Naegleria fowleri and how it doesn't seek us out to try to kill us, the flea isn't looking to just infect us with the plague. Infection happens by what seems to be purely an accident. You see, when a flea feeds on an infected host, the bacteria is of course ingested. It then proliferates the flea's digestive tract and forms a plug of sorts. This presents a bit of a problem to the flea because it stops up the flea's gut and the flea has difficulty eating. So what happens now is when the flea tries to feed on something that isn't infected, like say a human, as it's feeding it begins to regurgitate some of the blood meal back up, along with pieces of this bacterial plug, which then introduces very large amounts of the bacteria into the uninfected host. Looking at it from a human standpoint, this is of course a problem, because the plague can kill you. There are a multitude of animals that can harbor this particular flea: rock squirrels, ground squirrels, wood rats, prairie dogs, mice, rabbits, chipmunks, voles, and carnivores that eat infected animals. Infection is particularly prevalent in areas with a high rodent density. As far as infection cycles go, there are two different kinds that exist. There's what is known as enzootic. This is when you have a low rate infection among a population of rodents. This typically causes a lot of the rodents to die within the population. The populations where enzootic cycles occur typically act as reservoirs for the bacteria for the long term. The second type of infection cycle is known as epizootic. This is where animals outside the populations that are normally infected become infected themselves. And this is where we as humans can get infected. Human beings are more likely to get infected with Yersinia pestis shortly after or even during an epizootic cycle. It typically can present in three different forms: the bubonic plague, the septicemic plague, and the pneumonic plague. Let's look at the bubonic plague first. The bubonic plague makes up 80% of the plague cases in the United States right now. Its overall incubation period is typically 2 to 8 days, and it presents with fever, headache, chills, and of course, buboes. Now, what are buboes? Buboes are basically infected lymph nodes. They're located usually in the groin and the armpits. Our lymph nodes typically swell in response to infection, and once inside the body, Yersinia pestis gathers in the lymph nodes and multiplies. And if not properly treated, it can move into one of the other two forms. Okay, so now let's look at septicemic plague. Septicemic plague can present itself as the initial symptoms of infection with Yersinia pestis, or it can result from untreated bubonic plague. And if that's the case, of course, it presents with buboes. It also presents with fever, chills, severe weakness, abdominal pain, shock, bleeding on the skin or even internally, and tissue death, particularly on the nose, toes, and fingers. This is one of the symptoms that gives the plague its moniker, the Black Plague, because when tissue death is occurring, the affected tissue turns black. The incubation period for septicemic plague is not currently well known, but it seems to occur within days of initial infection. And finally, let's look at the pneumonic plague. The incubation period for pneumonic plague is typically 1 to 3 days. It presents with fever, headache, weakness, shortness of breath, the rapid onset of pneumonia, chest pains, coughing, shock, and respiratory failure. Watery or bloody mucus can also sometimes occur. Pneumonic plague is highly contagious and very deadly. Infection may develop from inhaling droplets of infected sputum or simply untreated bubonic or septicemic plague once it makes its way into the lungs. It also seems that on very rare occasions, humans have become infected through contact with infected pelts or animals. Well, obviously, if we have all this information about it, there must be treatment for it, right? Yes. The most common treatment for Yersinia pestis is antibiotics. Two of the most common and effective treatments for Yersinia pestis are the aminoglycoside antibiotic gentamicin and fluoroquinolones, which are broad-spectrum antibiotics. Alright, so what are the chances that you're going to get it? The chances that you're going to contract Yersinia pestis are probably really low. According to the CDC, between the years 1970 and 2020, there were only 496 cases of plague infection in the United States. Currently, the annual range of infection in the United States is between 1 and 17 cases, with an average of 7 cases each year. As it happens, the last urban outbreak of plague happened between 1924 and 1925 in Los Angeles. Okay, with all this in mind, how can we prevent it? One of the best things that can be done to reduce the possibility of infection with Yersinia pestis is to reduce the likelihood of rodents living around your property. Whether it's cutting down foliage or making the area generally unappealing to them, reducing the number of rodents in your area can help to cut down on the possibility of being infected with the plague. It's also important when out and about in areas that may have high rates of infection to wear gloves and use bug repellent. Also, using proper flea treatments and preventatives on your pets if you live in an area that has a high rate of infection. Another thing would be to not let outside cats and dogs into your home if you live in an area that has a known high rate of infection with Yersinia pestis. So guys, as always, I hope you enjoyed this video. If there's anything in particular you ever want me to address or talk about, a specific type of infectious disease, feel free to leave me a comment or send me a message and I'll be more than happy to talk about it. Thanks again for watching and have a great evening.